In the summer of 1967, the peaceful foothill community of Altadena seemed like the kind of place where tragedy belonged only in newspapers, never on the streets where children played until sunset and neighbors greeted one another by name. Families left their doors unlocked, bicycles rested carelessly on sidewalks, and the laughter of children drifted through the warm California air from morning until dusk. It was the sort of neighborhood where parents felt safe allowing their children to roam freely, believing that every nearby home offered protection, every familiar face could be trusted, and every street corner carried only the innocence of childhood. For the Bareilly family, August 9, 1967, began like any other ordinary summer day. 7-year-old Cecilia Renee Bareilly was bright, energetic, and endlessly curious, always asking questions that made adults smile, while her 6-year-old sister Roberta and followed her older sister everywhere, copying her words, her laughter, and even the way she walked. To neighbors, the two girls were inseparable, often seen holding hands, racing down sidewalks, or inventing games in empty lots and front yards. That afternoon, dressed in matching blue capri pants and striped t-shirts, the sisters stepped outside to play near their home, just as they had done countless times before. Nothing about the day suggested danger. Nothing hinted that within hours, their names would become part of one of Southern California's most haunting and heartbreaking unsolved murder cases. As the afternoon passed and shadows began to stretch across the lawns of Altadena, the Bareilly family expected the familiar sound of running footsteps and excited voices returning home for dinner. But the girls never came back. At first, there was only mild concern. Perhaps they had wandered into a neighbor's backyard. Perhaps they were playing at a friend's house and had simply lost track of time. Perhaps they would come running around the corner at any moment, apologizing for being late. But as daylight faded and evening settled over the neighborhood, concern turned into fear. Richard Bareilly and his family began searching the streets, calling out the girls' names, knocking on doors, checking garages, yards, and nearby parks. Soon neighbors joined the search. Porch lights switched on. Flashlights pierced the darkness. Cars cruised slowly through residential streets while worried voices echoed through the quiet neighborhood, calling for Cecilia and Roberta, hoping for any answer. But none came. Within hours, law enforcement was notified, and what had begun as a neighborhood search transformed into a full-scale missing children investigation. Detectives quickly realized something deeply unsettling. The girls had not simply wandered away. Someone had taken them. News of the disappearance spread rapidly throughout Los Angeles County. Parents pulled their children indoors. Doors that had always remained open were suddenly locked. Streets that normally echoed with children's laughter fell silent. For the next 18 hours, the Bareilly family lived in a nightmare of uncertainty, clinging desperately to hope while investigators searched desperately for any sign of the sisters. Then came the phone call that shattered whatever hope remained. In a wheat-filled vacant lot near the iconic Watts Towers, nearly 25 miles from the girls' home, investigators made a horrifying discovery. The bodies of Cecilia and Roberta had been found. Even seasoned detectives were shaken by what they saw. Both little girls had been sexually assaulted. Both had been strangled. Scarves had been tied tightly around their small necks, one yellow, one white, the knots pulled with deadly force. Yet it was not only the brutality of the murders that disturbed investigators. It was the way the bodies had been placed. The girls had not been carelessly dumped or hidden. Instead, they appeared to have been positioned deliberately, almost arranged, as though the killer wanted the scene to be found exactly as it was. The eerie staging raised immediate questions. Detectives began wondering whether this crime was intended to send a message. In 1967, Los Angeles was still emotionally scarred by the Watts riots, and racial tensions remained dangerously close to the surface. Some investigators considered the chilling possibility that the murders may have been designed to inflame those tensions, to provoke fear, anger, or even violence. It was a theory that quickly spread through the media, adding another layer of horror to an already unimaginable crime. Yet Richard Bareilly firmly rejected the idea. He insisted his neighborhood was integrated, peaceful, and harmonious. He refused to believe his daughters had become victims in some twisted political or racial message. But whatever the motive, one fact remained undeniable. Someone had committed an unspeakable crime, and somewhere that person was still free. The investigation intensified immediately. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, known offenders, city workers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with the sisters. Tips flooded in from across Southern California. Hundreds of leads were examined. Then investigators focused on one man, Anthony David Dontonville. 35 years old, a former City Parks employee, Dontonville was described as quiet, socially awkward, eccentric and unsettling to those who knew him. Some called him harmless but strange. Others described him as deeply troubled. To investigators, he stood out immediately. Yet despite their suspicions, the evidence linking him to the murders was surprisingly thin. There were no eyewitnesses who saw him with the girls. No fingerprints connected him to the crime scene. No physical evidence directly tied him to the murders. In an era before modern DNA analysis, investigators relied heavily on witness testimony, and the prosecution's case soon centered almost entirely on one man, Everett May, a drinking companion of D'Antonville who claimed that during a night at a bar, D'Antonville had leaned toward him and muttered 4 chilling words, "I did it." Those words became the foundation of the state's entire case. In November 1967, Anthony D'Antonville stood trial for the murders of Cecilia and Roberta Bareilles. The proceedings moved with astonishing speed. Incredibly, the trial lasted barely a day and a half. The defense called no witnesses. No alternative theories were presented. No aggressive challenges were made against the prosecution's evidence. It was as if the outcome had already been decided before the first testimony had even concluded. The jury deliberated quickly and returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. For many across Los Angeles, it seemed justice had been delivered. Parents breathed easier. Newspapers described the community's relief. For the Bareilles family, though no verdict could ever heal their loss, there was at least the belief that the man responsible would pay for what he had done. But the sense of closure did not last. D'Antonville's conviction was overturned after higher courts determined he had received ineffective legal representation and had not been given a fair defense. A new trial was ordered, and suddenly one of California's most emotionally charged murder cases returned to the courtroom. In 1968, D'Antonville's defense was taken over by attorney Charles Hollapeter, a skilled and dramatic litigator who would later become associated with the defense of Charles Manson. Hollapeter attacked the prosecution's case with relentless precision. He questioned Everett May's credibility, highlighting inconsistencies in his story, his alcohol use, and his motives for coming forward. Was he sober enough to hear a confession? Was he trustworthy? Was he telling the truth or simply seeking attention? Piece by piece, Hollapeter dismantled the state's most important witness. Then he shifted the focus entirely. He argued that Anthony D'Antonville was not being judged based on evidence, but because he was strange, awkward, and socially different. In one of the trial's most memorable moments, Hollapeter invoked The Stranger by Albert Camus, arguing that society often condemns those who make others uncomfortable, even without proof of guilt. The jury listened carefully. And this time the verdict was very different. Anthony D'Antonville was acquitted. For the Bareilles family, it was another devastating blow. 2 innocent little girls had been brutally murdered, yet the man most believed responsible walked out of the courtroom a free man. But D'Antonville's troubles did not end there. Investigators discovered that just days before Cecilia and Roberta disappeared, he had molested a 6-year-old girl in El Monte. In 1969, he was sentenced as a mentally disordered sex offender and sent to Atascadero State Hospital for treatment. Doctors reportedly concluded he was beyond rehabilitation, and he was later returned to prison. After 1970, Anthony D'Antonville largely disappeared from public records, leaving behind only suspicion, unanswered questions, and a cloud of doubt that never fully lifted. The Bareilles murders continued to ripple far beyond the courtroom. Politically, the case sparked public conflict between Sam Yorty and Yvelle Younger, exposing divisions within the justice system and fueling public outrage. Parents across Southern California questioned whether their children were truly safe. Communities questioned whether justice had been served. And for the Bareilles family, no legal argument, no political debate, and no courtroom verdict could ever erase the emptiness left by the loss of Cecilia and Roberta. Nearly 6 decades later, the murders of the Bareilles sisters remain officially unsolved. No other suspects were ever charged. No definitive forensic evidence ever emerged. Anthony D'Antonville remains legally innocent of the murders, yet for many investigators and journalists who studied the case, suspicion never disappeared. But suspicion is not proof, and in a courtroom, proof is everything. That is what makes the story of Cecilia and Roberta Bareilles so important for education and awareness. It reminds us that justice depends not only on instinct, public opinion, or who appears guilty, but on evidence, reliable witnesses, competent legal defense, and thorough investigation. When any of those fail, the consequences can echo across generations. The story of Cecilia and Roberta is more than a cold case. It is a painful reminder of innocence lost, of a community forever changed, and of a justice system that sometimes struggles to deliver the answers victims deserve. Nearly 60 years later, two little sisters from Altadena still wait for the truth, and until that truth is found, their names deserve to be remembered.